Welcome to Coming Home, Survive and Thrive in Homeschooling. This series is designed to explore how our education system is failing our children. My plan is to produce as many ideas as possible from not only what is the problem, but what can be done about it and how to go about it. At first glance, it may be a puzzle as to why this is on a homeschool podcast. Whilst much of what I produce is directly to promote surviving and thriving in homeschooling, I also believe it's wise to be aware of what's happening in your community, country, and in our world. Not only will it assist you to determine your why in homeschooling, but it will help to make sense of your life outside of homeschooling, in which you and your children must live. It has been said that knowledge is power. When you know and comprehend what is going on around you, you are better placed to make decisions based on facts rather than feelings. Today we hear from Marty Gibson, a commentator, writer and journalist, who will start to unpack the basic failings as he sees them and maps out ideas of what can be done. Although he speaks from a New Zealand perspective, you can see commonalities no matter where you live, which is a separate and interesting thing in itself. Marty starts by telling us a little about himself. Good morning, Marty. Thank you.
Good morning.
I'm so thrilled that you've come on. Thank you for saying yes.
Thanks for asking.
I'm going to ask you to introduce yourself and give a really quick, are you a journalist? Are you a reporter? What are you, a writer?
It's quite tough to say what I do, because when I was a kid I used to read a lot of Jack London books, and a lot of the authors that I admired had done a lot of different things. So I started out as I did a degree in science and a postgrad in marketing. Then I worked a big American chemical company doing engineering sales. And then I started up a quarry for another corporate, and then I went and sold used cars. Since then, I've just done all sorts of things. One of the things I did, coming back from overseas, I ended up back in my hometown of Gisborne. I managed the venue for Rhythm and Vines when it went to 17,000 people, and I was painting toilets for the council. New Zealand's Gisborne's Brokeback Mountain, I didn't realise, but I was filling in holes and stuff. Then, I got a call. I'd written a couple of letters to the editor, and they didn't need to fix them up, and so they asked if I'd like to be a proofreader, and I said, yeah, sure, I'll have a go at that. And then I got in there and met the chief reporter, and she said, well, do you want to have a go at being a reporter? And I said, yes. So I did that for 5 years.
And can you tell me, please, how you come to be so knowledgeable and interested in what the state of our schooling situation is in New Zealand?
Well, when I decided to leave that first corporate job I had out of university, I went to the States. And I it was a very definitive break in my life. When I was 18, New Zealand's divorce rate peaked. When I first started working, obviously at age 18, a lot of men who'd just been through harrowing divorces just say, don't get married, boy. Go overseas. Just this very nihilistic baby boomer Luciferian sort of advice, do what thou willst. And so rather than getting married and buying a house with my shares options and building on my career, I pursued pleasure and adventure. And when I was in the States, I ended up living in Arizona and Mexico and hung out with a bunch of Vietnam veterans, and they gave me a lot of books to read. So at about age 25, 26, I read None Dare Call It Conspiracy, which is about fractional reserve banking and how that was implemented and the effects it's had, and everything flowed from that. I don't see what's happening as accidental. I see it as a result of what the people who print money want to happen. And so for 25 years I've been seeing that. And also because I studied geology at university, I understood climate change. I understood the energy balance in the atmosphere, and my professors were saying, look, it's just a UN tax revenue generator. So I've had that jaundiced view of things with enough knowledge to do my own analysis, and as a consequence, I've been rather cynical about most of what I've been seeing on the news.
So I think I can safely say that you know how to think, not necessarily just believing what we're told to think.
I'm comfortable being an outsider as well. I was at a meeting, it was a dinner party, about 12 women. I think there was one man there, but and one lady at that said to me, everyone who seems to be resistant to this menticide, everyone who's like that is an outsider. And I thought, well, yeah, that's right, because when I was a kid, by the time I was 10, I'd gone to 4 different schools in 3 different countries. And, arriving at each one with an accent that marked me out as a foreigner. So being outside the herd, it doesn't strike terror into me in the way it does so many people.
Right, because you're kind of used to doing that. So New Zealand's traditional tall poppy syndrome probably doesn't bother you too much then?
No. I find in some ways I'm more at home in Australia because they're more forthright and outspoken. I have Australasian patriotism. Some of my best mates are Australian, and it doesn't bother me.
Right. I had wondered when you were talking about being an outsider if that was similar to or the same as being a contrarian, but from just listening to you now, that probably isn't necessarily so.
No, I'm a truth seeker. I want to know the truth, and if the facts available to me change, I'll change my opinion if I feel it warrants it. And I enjoy being proven wrong. It's a measure of growth.
Yeah, I think so too. And I don't like the phrase contrarian just for the sake of it. I don't enjoy being a contrarian. It's tiring to swim against the tide sometimes. But all right, Marty, can you please identify then for us? We've talked about the failing system in the New Zealand schools, which we realise is just it's very similar right throughout the Western world. So most of our listeners will be able to identify. Can you please identify what you see are the key failings in our system, please?
The taproot of our system reaches down to hell. If you look at the people who are venerated in New Zealand's teachers' colleges, Michel Foucault, I've talked about him on Media Matters. He's a pedophile and raped children. And I got asked by a teacher, did you, because I went back to Waikato to study counselling a couple of years ago, and I just, you get that, you just have to tell them what they want to hear. And I'm like, look, if maybe at an undergraduate level, if I'm doing postgraduate work, I want to introduce some new thoughts and stress test them. I don't want to be lying. I want to be telling the truth. And if this system demands that I have to lie to get through it, I'm not interested in that. I'll read some books, do my own thing. And, a teacher said to me, are you still doing that course? And I said, no, there's just too much Foucault. And she said, oh, I love Foucault. And I said, did you know that he argued against the age of consent, even down to infants, with a whole lot of other French pervert intellectuals? Did you know that? Mm-hmm. Do you think that's a suitable guy to be guiding your pedagogical philosophy? And John Money, the New Zealand pervert who, did those horrendous experiments on those twin boys and absolutely blocked anyone who suggested it was anything less than a roaring success. And it's still the basis, I'm told, I haven't found it, for Inside Out's justification of their gender theory. They still hold him up as, and his both kids, one died of a drug overdose, one committed suicide, the father committed suicide because out of guilt and shame for what he'd done. These people are satanic, and I'm not a particularly religious person, but there's a very Luciferian kind of angle to the way they see the world, very hateful. If you read Marx, such an angry, hateful man. And so these guys who are designing these education systems for our children are Marxists. When I lived in Wellington, I think I was probably about late 20s, and I had a job selling water coolers. And I knocked on the door of a Ministry of Education policy analyst, and this wretched little man answered the door whose these very, very thick glasses that he was squinting through, and he had this ill-fitting tweed suit with dandruff all over it. Just this sort of, and he said, yes? I was kind of recovering from the shock of seeing him, and then he was elbowed out of the way by this large, I presume, lesbian woman with a buzz-cut haircut and dungarees, and she said, what do you want? And I just stood there for a moment too long. I didn't have children at that stage, but I was thinking, these people are deciding what my children are going to learn. Then, working the paper I was doing out of the education department of the university, we were doing this paper on mediation or negotiation. I remember we were all there and everyone was excited to be doing it. The people doing it very nice. And a lady came in and said, are you using this lecture hall? And the lady who was the lecturer said, yes, well, and just really went off on it. And I looked around and all my classmates were looking and thinking, you're teaching us mediation? How to conduct smooth interpersonal negotiations. And it's like that with so many teachers. Not the teachers, but the people who are setting the agenda for the way our children learn. I think some of the best material on the failings of our education system that I've seen come from, I think the New Zealand Institute have some great analysis. And I mean, there's one graph which was on a recent paper they did called New Zealand's Education Delusion, how bad ideas ruined a once world-leading school system. And it's got these OECD measures of competency in maths. And they start out in 2000 pretty high, and then they all reading, writing, maths, they head down. But the percentage of school leavers with NCEA level 2 is going up. So it's like these two graphs are crossing. While the system's getting worse and worse, they're patting themselves on the back and saying it's getting better and better. And I guess having, with children, it's personal for me now. The fact that they're presiding over a system that's failing and trying to gaslight us that it's great has real consequences for children, and they shouldn't be able to get away with it. So the reason I'm happy to talk to you and the reason I'm happy to be in public saying this is I think it needs to be said, and we need to say it louder and louder.
Thank you. Give us some facts, just so that people don't think that, it's a myth, it's a conspiracy. I have heard that there's more than 50% of our school leavers are leaving with unable to, would you say they're unable to or just inadequate reading, writing and numeracy?
I think it's 1 in 5 are sufficiently illiterate that they can't play a meaningful role in society in terms of employment. And despite a 32% real rise in per pupil spending since 2001, students have gone from world leading to decidingly average. In reading, maths and science, students now perform far worse than the previous generation just 18 years ago. In all 3 subjects, 15-year-olds have lost the equivalent of between 3 and 6 terms worth of schooling. Far fewer pupils today perform at the highest levels, far more lack the most basic proficiency. So it's, for reading and maths, it's 55% roughly don't pass the expected level of education in the OECD. That's the tip of the iceberg, because you could pass that reading test or the numeracy test and still be functionally illiterate. You might be able to read, but you might not comprehend what you're reading, and beyond that, you might not be able to comprehend what you're reading and form a cogent argument against it. Where I think a bit differently to most people is that I have come to realize that governments love anything that makes people demand less freedom and more government. And so I don't see this stuff as accidental. I think it suits them just fine to have people who can't analyze what they're being told and form a cogent argument against it. And that puts a whole new spin on it. And I think New Zealanders, and as people around the world wake up to this, the challenge is, what's the alternative? And how do we respond to it without turning into some violent, unpleasant, and counterproductive reaction?
Before we look at some solutions then, let's go back to trying to figure out some of those numbers and what adequacy and inadequacy and these standards actually mean. So you've got those who are leaving school and who would have difficulty in filling in forms, reading instructions, even be able to navigate their way around, an online supermarket cart, although most of that's visual anyway. What about those who are functioning adequately but are undereducated. How could we find out what measure of percentage that is? So if we're assuming, okay, there's 55% who can't function very well in society, what about that percentage who are doing okay, but still not, their comprehension's not too good, but they could be administratively okay? How would we find out that?
Again, I think the start is to stop seeing it through this neo-Marxist lens where all hierarchies are based on power imbalance rather than competence. I've had some very, very worrying conversations with teachers, and one of them was a teacher said he'd gone to the deputy principal and said, I've got these kids in my class who are really talented at writing, and I'd like to give them some extension work. And the deputy principal sighed indulgently and said, well, their cup is full. And so you see that word inequity creeping into everything that's government related. And that's the idea that all kids should be the same. So the school recently was doing some pilot course out of Massey University. And so I looked it up, and the first word is equity in big letters at the top. And it was saying maths is a major driver of inequity because, some children are better at it than others, and that affects income. So, if we put them all together, then equity. It comes down to that thing. Socialists don't love poor people. They just hate rich people. The problem with that is if you're teaching a child, you've got to teach them just a little bit ahead of what their capability is. So you really do need to be streaming them, and you can improve education just by getting in that sweet spot of being close to what their knowledge is and just reaching beyond it enough so they learn. If you mix up a class of all different abilities, the bright ones are bored, the ones who are lagging, it's still too far ahead of them to make it up, and it's just shocking that people are playing these games with children's lives.
They are like games, aren't they? Because there's two levels of tragedy here. One is the personal one that is going to affect that child for the rest of their life as they go into adulthood. That reflects all in the community and society in which we live. But the consequences of the social aspect of it, the presumed manipulation of it, like you were referring before to, undereducation, lack of comprehension, kind of suits what politicians want. And here I think we're kind of getting into something that I get the feeling most people either don't know it's going on or they don't want to know it's going on. Let's just focus then on the parents who are aware that something might be going on. What would you suggest they do about their child right now who's in a primary school and they're not quite sure what's going on? Have you got any advice?
I've got 3 children, okay? I've got a daughter who's 6, a son who's 7, and another daughter who's just turned 12. And so the 2 oldest ones we've shifted to private school. Our middle child had one learning difficulty. So he's got his processing rate is a little bit slow, but he's very, very bright on other things. But he was just getting left behind in the open plan class system. And it's worth knowing, the open plan class system was introduced, I think, around 2010 because someone in the ministry heard a TED talk saying it was a good idea. And there's been no testing about the efficacy of it ever since. I read my children challenging books from a young age, and I've always been surprised, given how flashy television is, how much children love being read to. And I exercise them. We've got a hill nearby, and my daughter started just enjoying sitting around watching TV and eating crap food. And so we started climbing the hill once a week, and it started out, how far can you get in 30 minutes? And then we got to the top in 30 minutes, and how fast can we do it? And then it was, how fast can you do it if I put an 8 kilo kettlebell in your backpack? And then we do, sprints. And she didn't like it at first, but then, if I did it so she could see her improvement, her own motivation started to kick in. And that's a real issue I have with the whole play-based learning thing. It's like, if they just do what they want, they miss out on learning what they like. Play-based teaching is still teacher-guided play-based teaching. Yeah, let's not pretend. One of the ways they sold feminism to women, and I know this is someone who does the majority of the housework and childcare, my wife's a very clever lady. The way they sold feminism to women was to grossly underplay how much time it took to lovingly and properly raise a child so they fulfill their potential. You can't leave it to TV, and it's worth putting in the time to do the research about how much screen time's bad. If your child's getting overweight, well, if they're eating sugar, high fructose corn syrup, and drinking calories, that's going to happen. You've got to take ownership. You can't trust the school to do it. I think they give them homework. I think they give kids homework to basically share the blame often. I think, parents don't do the homework for their kids and think, oh, well, if they're not doing that well, I've only got myself to blame.
For young children, I really struggle with the concept of homework anyway. They're children. They're tiny children often. Why aren't you giving them adequate...
for 8 hours.
Yeah, you've already got them.
If what you're doing isn't cutting it in that time, maybe you should look at what you're doing.
Yes, but I'm interested in that thought that you just said before, is that it's almost like a passive way of introducing blame. I haven't heard that before. I'm going to give that some thought. That's really interesting. So let me run over that again, is that if you have assigned homework for the child, who is probably tired and had enough of school anyway, and child doesn't do it, then teacher can blame parent. Is that the avenue you're thinking?
Well, I'm thinking parent blames themselves. I mean, our children were a bit slow to read when they were younger. I did think that. I thought, well, I'm probably not helping. They all came right, but I think you've got to lock in the reading habit, and that we're going to see a big shift, a generation gap between people who read a lot of books and then people who just, the kids who just stopped reading altogether. But yeah, I mean, if in terms of what to do, we're in unprecedented times at the moment. This isn't business as usual. There's a guy called Unwin who studied collapsing civilizations. Studied about 85 of them or so. One of the things he saw in every single one, a pattern that was unshakable, was that once a civilization destigmatized premarital sex, it collapsed within 3 generations. And if you think back to the 60s, when the pill was introduced and the sexual revolution happened, we're there now. Whenever a civilization collapses, you have parallel civilizations within the civilization that survive and form the nucleus of whatever comes next, but they don't recover. When you're schooling your children, you're not schooling them for when you were 5 or however old they are. They're facing a whole new series of challenges, and so you've got to think, well, what's my tribe? Who are the parents that I'm forming a sane society with? And what skills are they going to need? Really get that ability to think critically up and running in them as quickly as you can.
Oh gosh, I'm just thinking of so many parents that I just see who are just so busy with work, kids' sports, don't get me started about that one, it's not for today. It's like there's an acceptable agenda in society to make someone as busy as they can so they're too tired to even begin to think about what might be important that they're not doing, let alone the actual doing it. So I'm hearing you say, I think, Marty, that a parent needs to take stock, decide what can be done, and maybe even make some sacrifices to their own personal lifestyle for the sake of their child or children. Can you just tease that out just a little bit more? Because
start thinking about buying a new boat that's flashier than the one you need in terms of time. Think about the new car in terms of time. And I mean, my father was a workaholic. He was a GP. He was doing obstetrics. Sometimes he worked 80 hours a week. I would far rather have had his time than any material benefit that conferred. Far rather. Love my father. We're still close, but I think he realizes now that it wasn't the right choice in a lot of ways. So I've kind of, we fishtail down the generation, overcorrection after overcorrection. That's probably one of the reasons I spend so much time with my kids. Probably too much. I hacked my career to death years ago, so I don't care what other people think in terms of what car I drive. I see myself as smart if I can get a car for not very much and it just keeps running, and I don't have to make any payments on it.
You really are an outlier, aren't you? Excellent.
Yeah.
Let's just take it back to very bare basics. Let's say someone's listening to this and they're saying, oh my God, could this be my child? What questions could they be asking the teacher of their child? And then what do you do with that information? And if you're not happy with it, what are some options for a concerned parent?
Yeah, I mean, well, I've given you a pretty hopeless answer, haven't I? I've just said, send them to school and, talk about things when they come home and do your own things so they've got capability beyond what they're learning at school. I mean, I did suggest on a show, maybe it's time we got on the board of trustees for schools again. Because, I mean, there's so much I see. We had a play recently, school play. I went along to see at the school my kids started at. And, they got a girl to place Redmond Hillary, things like that, just little. And then my youngest daughter was singing the song. It was about Kate Shepherd and the fight for women's rights, and they were singing "If I Was a Boy." I don't know where the song comes from, and she was singing that when she was at home, and I said, do you reckon it's better being a boy, honey? And she said, yeah. And I said, why is it better? And she said, oh, because you don't have to do the dishes and things like that. Who does the dishes in our house? You do. There's that. And, this is an education system that sends 50% more females than males onto tertiary education. So, I mean, just by that measure, it's failing boys. It's not as bad as in America where they're creating these schools that are making boys mentally ill, and so they're medicating them, with speed, with amphetamines. But, it's not a healthy environment for boys. I'm trying to think of a simple fix for it. I think speaking out and doing your best. Mm. I stopped drinking altogether about 2.5 years ago, and I often say to people, if you want to be a better parent, if you've got any concerns at all about you drinking, stopping drinking will be a major plus. And people, when I say that, often think, were you smashing your car up and getting... none of that. I was drinking too much, like a lot of Kiwis. Before I stopped, I did a bit of a pros and cons list. All of the pros to drinking turned out to be an illusion. And the cons were actually more complex and worse than I thought. Oh. And you always think about it in terms of yourself, but what you don't think of is how good it is for other people, strangers you meet, and they find you as a far more insightful, healthy, compassionate person, and your children get a much better time with you, I think.
Did you choose, just out of interest, to stop drinking entirely? Was that easier than just choosing to drink in moderation?
Yes, because I found choosing to drink in moderation was like having a toddler tugging at my sleeve the whole time.
Okay, got it. Okay, that's interesting. See, my husband and I come from traditional Baptist circles, and we grew up in the era when it was pretty much Baptists just didn't drink. It's not like that now, but that's still our habit, not to drink. And so it's really interesting coming across people who are choosing to not drink.
I got so drunk that I couldn't walk and threw up in my parents' hall for the first time when I was 4.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. At a hospital party with doctors and nurses and going around asking them for a sip of my drink. And so, yeah, I probably had those Celtic genes that predisposed me to like it. And I get, a good dopamine hit out of it, but it's fake. Mm. Mm. And once the scales come off your eyes, you can never look at it the same.
Wow. Well, look, I'm going to round it up, and then Zoom's going to quit. Okay.
Thanks very much. That was great. Good luck with your podcast.
Oh, thank you.
Well done.
Thank you so much.
Initiative. It's a great thing to be doing, and I hope it reaches a lot of people and makes a difference.
Coming up in this series will be interviews with folk who chose to stay in the public system and how they mitigate and navigate it. Those who have made changes, and all the options that go with each direction you can take. Please let me know if you have suggestions on possible interviews, or have questions, comments, or experiences to tell me about. You can find me on my website, cominghomeinfo.com. Have a great week, and I'll catch up with you next time. Bye-bye now.